January 17th, 1944, Cassino, Italy. The ancient stones of Highway 6 had felt the tread of Roman legions, medieval pilgrims, and merchant caravans for more than 2,000 years. By January of 1944, those same stones would feel something different. The weight of tanks, the boots of soldiers from a dozen nations, the desperate flight of civilians caught between armies that were turning their homeland into a graveyard. Maria Benedetti stood at the window of her family's farmhouse 3 miles south of Cassino, watching the road that had been the artery of her entire life. She was 42 years old, a widow with 3 children. Her husband had died in the first months of Italy's war, killed in North Africa, fighting for Mussolini's dreams. Now those dreams had collapsed into nightmare, and the road outside her window, the road she'd walked to market every week for 2 decades, the road her children had played beside, the road that connected her small world to Rome, had become something she no longer recognized. Before we continue with Maria's story and the transformation of this ancient highway into one of World War II's most contested battlegrounds, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button. Stories like these, about real people caught in the machinery of history, need to be told. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what stories from the war you'd like us to cover next. The road had many names across its long history. The Romans called it Via Casilina. By 1944, military maps labeled it Highway 6. To the Allied soldiers advancing north through Italy, it was simply the road to Rome. To the Germans defending every meter of Italian soil, it was the jugular vein they had to protect at all costs. And to the Italian civilians trapped along its length, it had become the road to nowhere, a killing ground where the future and past collided with devastating force. Highway 6 ran 150 miles from Naples through the Liri Valley, past the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, all the way to Rome. It was the most direct route through the mountains, the only practical passage for mechanized armies. Other routes existed, winding through treacherous mountain passes, but none offered what Highway 6 provided. A relatively flat, well-maintained road wide enough for columns of trucks and tanks, following the natural corridor of the Liri and Rapido river valleys. This geographical reality transformed Highway 6 from a civilian thoroughfare into a strategic prize worth any price. The Germans knew it, the Allies knew it, and the civilians living along its path learned it in the worst possible way. In the autumn of 1943, as Allied forces pushed north from their landing at Salerno, German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring faced a crucial decision. Hitler wanted him to hold Italy, to keep the Allies as far from Germany as possible, to prevent them from establishing bomber bases within range of the Reich. But Kesselring had limited resources, fighting a defensive war against enemies with superior numbers and complete air superiority. His solution was brilliant in its ruthlessness. He would use Italy's geography as a weapon. The Apennine Mountains that form the spine of Italy created natural defensive barriers. Kesselring ordered his engineers to construct a series of fortified lines across the peninsula, each one anchored on mountains, rivers, and key terrain features. The strongest of these lines was the Gustav Line, stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea in the west to the Adriatic in the east. And at the center of the Gustav Line, dominating the western approach to Rome, stood Monte Cassino. The mountain rose 1,700 feet above the town of Cassino and the Liri Valley. From its summit, German observers could see for miles in every direction. Every movement on Highway 6, every Allied vehicle, every troop concentration could be spotted and targeted. The mountain made Highway 6 unusable as long as German forces held it. Kesselring packed the Gustav line with his best troops, the 1st Parachute Division, Fallschirmjäger, elite soldiers who had distinguished themselves across every theater of the war. These weren't conscripts or garrison troops. They were veterans who knew their trade, who could turn a pile of rubble into a fortress, who could make the Allies pay in blood for every yard of ground. The German defenses at Cassino were masterpieces of military engineering. Concrete bunkers built into the hillsides with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun positions hidden in rubble and ruins where they couldn't be spotted until they opened fire. Minefields covering every approach. Artillery pre-registered on every likely avenue of attack. And above it all, on Monte Cassino itself, the ancient monastery, its walls 10 feet thick, offering views of the entire battlefield. For the Italian civilians living in Cassino and the surrounding towns, the arrival of German forces in late 1943 marked the end of any illusion of normalcy. The Germans were efficient and professional, but they made it clear that military necessity took precedence over civilian concerns. Houses were fortified. Cellars became ammunition storage. Roads were mined. Gardens became fields of fire. Maria Benedetti watched German soldiers dig positions in the hills behind her farmhouse. They were polite enough, these young men from Bavaria and Prussia, but their presence meant one thing. This area would become a battlefield. The question wasn't if, but when. She began preparing her family for what was coming. They gathered what food they could hide. They reinforced the cellar. They studied the surrounding terrain, planning escape routes if the fighting came too close. But where could they escape to? Highway 6 ran past their door, and both armies wanted control of it. North meant running toward the Germans. South meant running toward the Americans. Either direction meant the road. The first Allied assault on the Gustav Line began on January 17, 1944. British X Corps attacked across the Garigliano River near the coast. 2 days later, the British 46th Division crossed the river near its junction with the Lieri. These were diversionary attacks, meant to draw German reserves away from the main objective. The main assault fell on the American Corps. The 36th Infantry Division was ordered to cross the Rapido River 5 miles downstream from Cassino and establish a bridgehead that would allow follow-on forces to pour through and race up Highway 6 toward Rome. It was a sound plan on paper. In reality, it became one of the war's most catastrophic tactical failures. The Rapido River doesn't look dangerous on a map. It's only 25 to 50 feet wide at most points. But in January of 1944, winter rains had swollen it into a torrent with steep banks and swift current. The Germans had spent months preparing defenses on both banks. Every approach was mined and covered by machine guns. The far bank was a maze of bunkers and fortified positions. The 36th Division attacked on the night of January 20th. Within hours, the assault collapsed into chaos and slaughter. Boats were torn apart by machine gun fire before reaching the far bank. Men drowned in the icy water weighed down by equipment. Those who made it across found themselves pinned down by fire from positions they couldn't see. Engineers trying to build bridges worked under continuous artillery bombardment. By the time the attack was called off 2 days later, the 36th Division had suffered over 2,000 casualties. The Rapido River ran red, and Highway 6 remained firmly in German hands. Maria Benedetti heard the battle from her farmhouse, the continuous thunder of artillery, the rattle of machine guns that never seemed to stop, the night sky lit by flares and explosions. In the morning she could see smoke rising from the valley. The war had arrived. Over the following weeks, more attacks came. The French Expeditionary Corps, including tough mountain troops from North Africa, made progress in the hills north of Cassino, but couldn't break through completely. The American 34th Infantry Division fought its way to within 250 meters of the monastery itself, taking horrific casualties in close quarter fighting on the frozen slopes. But Monte Cassino held, and as long as it held, Highway 6 remained closed. Allied commanders grew increasingly frustrated. The stalemate at Cassino was delaying the entire Italian campaign. They had launched an amphibious assault at Anzio, 30 miles south of Rome, hoping to outflank the Gustav line. But instead of breaking out and cutting Highway 6 from the north, the Anzio force became besieged, another bloody stalemate, consuming men and resources. Something had to break the deadlock. Allied eyes turned to the monastery itself. Intelligence reports, most of them wrong, suggested that Germans were using the abbey as an observation post. Soldiers on the ground, looking up at those ancient walls, couldn't believe the enemy wasn't up there watching them. The psychological impact was enormous. Every man attacking felt like he was being observed from that hilltop sanctuary. The decision was made. Despite protests from officers who insisted the Germans weren't actually in the monastery, despite warnings that destroying it would hand the enemy a ready-made fortress, despite the cultural and religious significance, Monte Cassino Abbey was marked for destruction. On the morning of February 15th, 1944, Maria Benedetti heard a sound she'd never heard before, a deep, continuous roar that grew louder by the second. She ran outside and looked up to see the sky filled with aircraft. Bombers in formation, more planes than she could count, heading directly for Monte Cassino. The bombing lasted for hours. Wave after wave of American bombers dropped 1,400 tons of high explosives on the monastery. The ancient walls, which had stood for 1,500 years, which had survived earthquakes and earlier wars, crumbled under the assault. The Baroque church, the cloisters, the libraries containing priceless manuscripts, all reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. When the dust settled, the monastery was gone. In its place stood a shattered mass of broken stone. And inside that rubble, seeking shelter from the bombardment, were 230 Italian civilians who had fled there thinking it would be safe. They died in the ruins, killed by bombs meant to protect them from occupation. The bitter irony became clear almost immediately. Investigation after the bombing confirmed what many had suspected. There had been no German soldiers inside the monastery before the attack. Kesselring had ordered his troops to stay out, respecting its status as a religious sanctuary. But once the Allies destroyed it, the Germans moved in. The Fallschirmjäger of the 1st Parachute Division occupied the ruins and turned them into the strongest defensive position in all of Italy. The rubble provided perfect cover. The broken walls created dozens of firing positions. The Allies had handed them exactly what they feared the Germans already had. 3 more major assaults followed over the next 3 months. In each one, Highway 6 remained the prize, and each time the Germans held. New Zealand and Indian troops attacked in mid-February, making limited progress at terrible cost. The town of Cassino itself became a moonscape of rubble, where soldiers fought room to room, house to house, sometimes within feet of each other. Maria Benedetti's farmhouse stood near enough to Cassino that she could hear the street fighting, the sharp crack of rifles, the burst of grenades, the rumble of tank guns firing at point-blank range. Her children huddled in the cellar, hands over their ears, while she tried to keep them fed on dwindling supplies and prayed that a stray shell wouldn't find their home. In March, a massive Allied assault, preceded by a devastating bombardment, turned Cassino into a literal wasteland. Over 1,000 aircraft dropped bombs on the town and surrounding areas. Artillery fired hundreds of thousands of shells. When the bombardment lifted and New Zealand troops moved forward, they found the rubble impassable. Tanks couldn't navigate the cratered streets. Infantry became isolated in the ruins. The Germans, sheltering in cellars and bunkers, emerged to defend positions that the bombing had actually strengthened by creating obstacles. Highway 6, visible from the heights, remained death ground. Any vehicle that attempted to use it drew immediate fire. The road that had once carried commerce and connection now carried only war. Burned-out trucks lined its shoulders. Shell craters pocked its surface. Blood stained its ancient stones. The stalemate broke in May. The Allies assembled overwhelming force for a final assault. Operation Diadem involved over 20 divisions attacking along a 25-mile front. The Polish Corps, composed of soldiers who had fought their way from Russia through the Middle East to Italy, was given the honor of taking Monte Cassino itself. They would fight with desperate courage, knowing their homeland was occupied by both Nazis and Soviets, knowing that victory here was the only victory they might achieve for Poland. The offensive began on the night of May 11th, 1944, with an artillery bombardment from over 1,600 guns. The earth shook for miles around. Maria Benedetti gathered her children close in their cellar as the house trembled above them. Dust fell from the ceiling. Pictures fell from walls. The violence of modern war reduced their world to a stone box underground, where they waited to learn if they would see another sunrise. The Polish attack on Monte Cassino was launched on May 12th. The Poles advanced into a killing ground. German machine guns and artillery carved gaps in their ranks. Men fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. But the Poles kept coming. They had nowhere else to go, no other fight to win. Monte Cassino became their war, their chance to prove Polish valor still mattered in a world that had abandoned their nation. For 6 days, the battle raged on the slopes. The Germans, finally worn down by months of continuous combat, began to run short of ammunition and supplies. Allied aircraft and artillery had destroyed most of the roads bringing supplies forward. Casualties had thinned their ranks. On the night of May 17th, German commanders made the decision to withdraw. They had held Cassino for 4 months, inflicting over 55,000 Allied casualties. But the Gustav line was finally breaking. At 10:20 in the morning on May 18th, 1944, Polish soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of Monte Cassino Abbey. The battle was over. Highway 6 was open. The road to Rome lay ahead. Maria Benedetti emerged from her cellar into morning light. The guns had stopped. For the first time in months, the valley was quiet. But the silence felt wrong, unnatural. It was the silence of devastation. She walked outside and looked toward Cassino. The town was gone, erased from the map, nothing left but rubble. The monastery on the hill stood as a broken silhouette against the sky, and Highway 6, the road she had known all her life, was lined with the wreckage of war. Allied forces poured through the gap. Tanks, trucks, infantry, support vehicles, a torrent of military might racing toward Rome. German forces withdrew north, fighting delaying actions but no longer able to hold. On June 4, 1944, American forces entered Rome, the first Axis capital to fall. But the victory was overshadowed the next day when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. Italy became a sideshow, a secondary theater where soldiers would continue fighting and dying for another year. For the civilians who survived Cassino, liberation brought no celebration. Their homes were destroyed. Their town was rubble. The dead, both military and civilian, numbered in the thousands. Highway 6 was open, but it ran through a wasteland. The road that had connected their lives to the wider world had consumed those lives in the process of war. Maria Benedetti and her children survived. They were among the lucky ones. Thousands of Italian civilians died in the battle for Cassino and the surrounding areas. Most have no monuments, no records of their names. They were simply there when the armies came, when the road they used every day became the weapon that destroyed their world. The transformation of Highway 6 from civilian thoroughfare to military objective exemplifies a terrible truth about modern warfare. Geography doesn't change, but its meaning does. A road is just a road until armies need it. Then it becomes a prize worth any sacrifice, any cost in lives, any level of destruction. The civilians who live along that road, who built their homes and lives around it, become incidental casualties in a calculation where only military necessity matters. The Germans understood this when they fortified the Gustav line. They turned every village, every hill, every river crossing into a defensive position. The fact that Italians lived there, that these were communities with histories stretching back millennia, meant nothing compared to the strategic value of delaying the Allied advance by weeks or months. The Allies understood it too when they chose to bomb Monte Cassino Abbey. The cultural and religious significance of a 1,500-year-old monastery was weighed against potential military advantage and found wanting. And when the bombing killed hundreds of civilians seeking shelter, that too was factored into the cold arithmetic of war. Regrettable, but necessary. The road had to be opened. The battle for Highway 6 cost approximately 55,000 Allied casualties and 20,000 German casualties over 4 months of fighting. These numbers don't include Italian civilian casualties, which are harder to quantify, but certainly ran into the thousands. The town of Cassino was completely destroyed, every building damaged or demolished. The monastery was reduced to rubble and wouldn't be fully rebuilt for 2 decades. But the road was opened. Armies moved north toward victory. In the calculus of total war, Highway 6 served its purpose. That it did so at the cost of Italian communities, Italian lives, Italian history, was considered acceptable. The road everyone used became a weapon, and like all weapons, it destroyed without discrimination. Today, Highway 6 still exists. It's been rebuilt, paved, modernized. Cars and trucks travel its length daily, connecting Rome to Naples and the south. The town of Cassino has been rebuilt, a modern community that bears little resemblance to the medieval town that stood there before 1944. Monte Cassino Abbey was reconstructed between 1948 and 1956, rebuilt exactly as it had been before the war, every detail carefully restored from plans and photographs. Visitors to Monte Cassino can walk through the beautiful cloisters and churches, see the magnificent frescoes and artwork, stand on the terrace and look out over the Liri Valley and Highway 6, stretching into the distance. On clear days, you can see for miles. It's easy to understand why this position was so valuable, why men fought and died for months to control it. But if you look carefully, you can still find traces of the battle, bullet scars on a few walls that survived the bombardment, bunkers and defensive positions hidden in the hillsides, the Polish military cemetery, where over 1,000 soldiers who died taking the monastery are buried, their graves carefully maintained, each stone a testament to sacrifice. And along Highway 6 between Cassino and Rome, there are small memorials and plaques marking the battles fought, the units that passed through, the cost of victory. Most drivers passed them without noticing, focused on their destinations, unaware that the road beneath their wheels was once the most contested ground in Italy. The story of Highway 6 and the battle for Cassino reminds us that war transforms everything it touches. Roads become weapons, homes become fortresses, civilians become casualties, and ancient monasteries become tactical objectives worth any price. The Italian civilians who lived along Highway 6 in 1944 never asked to be part of history. They simply wanted to tend their farms, raise their children, live their lives. But history came to them in the form of armies fighting over a road, and their world was destroyed in the process. Maria Benedetti eventually left the Cassino area. Her farmhouse, heavily damaged in the fighting, was demolished after the war. She moved north with her children, starting over in a city where the war's scars were less visible. She rarely spoke about what she experienced, about the months spent in a cellar listening to battles rage overhead, about the day she emerged to find her world erased. Before she died in 1967, she returned once to Cassino. She stood on the rebuilt Highway 6, watching modern cars speed past, and tried to reconcile this peaceful scene with her memories of war. The road looked the same, following the same path it had for 2,000 years. But she knew better. This wasn't the same road. The road she remembered had been something else entirely, a weapon that consumed everything around it, that transformed ancient stones into a killing ground, that took the simple connector of communities and made it the fulcrum of war. She stood there for a long time, an old woman on a roadside, holding memories that the rushing traffic would never know. Then she turned away and never came back. If this story moved you, if it made you think about how war changes not just maps and borders, but the lives of ordinary people, then please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to telling these stories, the ones that don't make it into the big histories, the experiences of people like Maria Benedetti, who survived the transformation of their world into a battlefield. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what stories from World War II you'd like to hear next. Real stories about real people who lived through history's darkest moments. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering with us.